When the recovery diver broke the surface of the flooded Paddy, he did not speak. He held up a sealed plastic bag, cloudy with age, and inside it was a Polaroid photograph so faded that the faces in it had turned the color of weak tea. The team leader, a Navy lieutenant commander named Hargrove, waded out to meet him. He took the bag, held it to the light, and stood still for a long time. The photograph showed two men standing side by side in what appeared to be a hotel room. One of them was Captain Wendell Pritchard, whose skeleton was still strapped into the aircraft 17 feet below the brown water. The other was First Lieutenant Marvin Caldwell, whose name had been on the MIA rolls for 31 years, whose widow had buried an empty casket at Fort Sam Houston in 1973, and whose face, in the photograph, was smiling. The date written on the white border of the Polaroid, in soft black marker, was 3 days after the crash that was supposed to have killed them both. Hargrove turned the bag over. On the back of the photograph, in the same handwriting, was a single word he did not understand. He slid the bag into an evidence envelope and sealed it. Then he called Washington. To understand how that photograph ended up in a dead man's pocket at the bottom of a Cambodian rice paddy, we need to go back 31 years, to the early monsoon season of 1972, and to a fire base on the Cambodian border where two men climbed into a Cobra gunship and flew west into a war that only one of them intended to come back from. Drop a comment and let us know what city or part of the world you're tuning in from. And if this kind of storytelling is your thing, we'd love to have you subscribed. The farmer's name was Sok Vanara, and he had been plowing the same paddy outside Ratanakiri province for 40 years. In the spring of 2003, his iron plow blade caught something metallic 2 feet below the silt and stopped dead, nearly pulling the ox off its feet. He dug down with his hands and found a piece of aluminum the color of river clay, bolted to a shaft of steel, and he did not know what it was. He thought it was part of an old French drainage pipe. He was wrong. It was the rotor mast of an American AH-1G Cobra gunship, tail number 67 X-ray X-ray 284, and it had been buried there since the summer monsoon of 1972. Sok Vanara reported the find to the provincial authorities, who reported it to Phnom Penh, who reported it to the Joint POW/MIA Accounting Command in Hawaii. 6 weeks later, a 12-person recovery team arrived in Ratanakiri with excavation equipment, body bags, and a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez. The paddy was drained. Pumps ran day and night, and the water level dropped inch by inch until the outline of the aircraft began to emerge from the mud. A long, narrow fuselage, remarkably intact, lying on its left side with the stub wings sheared off and the canopy glass crazed but unbroken. The smell hit them first. Not decomposition, that had finished decades ago, but the deep mineral stink of laterite mud mixed with old aviation fuel, a smell like rust and kerosene that soaked into their clothes and stayed for days. The team worked with hand tools, brushes, and dental picks, peeling the silt back layer by layer. The Cobra's tandem cockpit, with its 2 seats arranged one behind the other, became visible on the 3rd day. Dr. Vasquez was the first to look inside. The back seat, the pilot station, contained skeletal remains. The bones were dark brown, stained by 31 years of mineral-rich water, but the skeleton was largely intact. It was still strapped into the seat harness. Fragments of a flight suit, faded to a color between green and gray, clung to the bones. Dog tags, corroded but legible, identified the remains as Captain Wendell A. Pritchard, serial number redacted, 1st Cavalry Division, attached to a unit designated only as Aero Rifle Troop, call sign Talon. The front seat, the gunner's station, was empty. This was not, in itself, unusual. Front seaters in Cobra crashes were sometimes thrown clear by the impact, and their remains could be scattered across a wide debris field. Dr. Vasquez ordered a search of the surrounding area. The team worked outward in concentric rings, probing the mud with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. They found fragments of plexiglass, a broken collective grip, and several dozen rounds of unfired 20mm ammunition. They did not find a second set of remains. What they did find, on the afternoon of the fourth day, was something that changed the nature of the recovery from a routine repatriation to something else entirely. A technician named Corporal Reyes, working with tweezers in the chest cavity of Pritchard's skeleton, extracted a sealed plastic bag from the left breast pocket of the flight suit. Inside the bag was a Polaroid photograph. It was faded, the colors shifted toward amber, but the image was readable. Two men stood in what appeared to be a hotel room. One of them was Pritchard. The other, identified later by comparison with service photographs, was First Lieutenant Marvin Caldwell, Pritchard's front seater, the man who was supposed to be in the empty cockpit. Caldwell was wearing civilian clothes. He was smiling, and the date written on the white border of the Polaroid in soft black marker was 3 days after the shootdown that had supposedly killed them both. Dr. Vasquez placed the Polaroid back in its evidence bag and sealed it. She made a notation in her field journal. She did not speculate. But that night, sitting in the team's temporary quarters in a cinder block guest house, she said one sentence to Hargrove that would define the next 2 years of investigation. She said, "The front cockpit was not broken open by the crash. It was opened from the outside, after impact, using the external canopy jettison handle. Somebody unlatched it deliberately from the ground." Hargrove picked up the satellite phone and called the JPAC headquarters in Hawaii. He asked for the original 1972 incident report on tail number 67 X-ray X-ray 284. The file arrived by encrypted email the following morning. It was 11 pages long, and the first thing Hargrove noticed was the witness statement attached to page 3, a sworn affidavit claiming that both crew members had been killed on impact, signed by an officer who, according to the unit roster, had been in Saigon on the day of the crash, 240 miles from the border. The firebase had no name that anyone used. On the maps, it was designated LZ Copperhead, but the pilots of Talon Troop called it the Sand Pit because of the red laterite dust that covered everything: the hooches, the revetments, the rotor blades, the food, the insides of their mouths. It sat on a low ridge 3 clicks east of the Cambodian border, in a stretch of triple canopy jungle that had been defoliated twice and was growing back in patches of sickly yellow-green scrub. The year was 1972. The war was winding down, or so the newspapers said, but nobody at LZ Copperhead had seen a newspaper in 6 weeks. Captain Wendell Pritchard had been in country for 9 months. He was 27 years old, from a town called Boaz in northern Alabama, and he had the kind of quiet, unhurried competence that made other pilots trust him without being able to explain why. He flew the back seat of the Cobra, the pilot station, with a precision that the maintenance crew appreciated because he brought the aircraft home without unnecessary damage. He did not drink much. He wrote long letters to his wife Louise on yellow legal pads, and he kept a photograph of her tucked under the instrument panel sun visor, held in place with a strip of olive drab tape. He was what the old hands called a straight arrow, and in the moral economy of a firebase in 1972, that distinction still meant something, though less every month. First Lieutenant Marvin Caldwell had arrived at Copperhead 6 weeks before Pritchard. He was 26, a West Point graduate, class of '68, and he carried himself with the particular kind of restless energy that could be mistaken for enthusiasm until you spent enough time around it to realize it was something else. He was smart. Everyone agreed on that. He could calculate a firing solution in his head faster than the ballistic computer, and he had a gift for reading terrain from the front seat that made him one of the best gunners in the troop. But there was a quality to Caldwell that unsettled people. He asked too many questions about things that were not his business. Supply routes, personnel transfers, the details of operations he was not assigned to. He spent his off hours not in the hooch playing cards or listening to armed forces radio, but walking the perimeter, talking to the Vietnamese interpreters, and on at least 2 occasions to Cambodian civilians who had crossed the border to trade. Warrant Officer Roy Thibodeau, who flew the other Cobra in the section, noticed it first. He mentioned it to Pritchard one evening while they were cleaning their personal weapons under the corrugated tin awning that served as the troops' armory. Thibodeau was from Houma, Louisiana, a compact, dark-haired man who spoke slowly and noticed everything. He said, "Your front seater spends a lot of time talking to people who ain't in this army." Pritchard said nothing. He ran a patch through the barrel of his .38 revolver, held it up to the light, and changed the subject. The smell of gun oil and mosquito repellent mixed in the heavy air. Somewhere behind the hooches, a radio was playing a Creedence Clearwater Revival song, tinny and distant. The sun was going down behind the tree line, and the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and green, the way it did before the monsoon storms rolled in from the west. Pritchard finished cleaning his weapon, snapped the cylinder shut, and slid it into his shoulder holster. He stood up and looked toward the perimeter, where Caldwell was standing alone, silhouetted against the wire, watching something to the west. Operation Stone Lantern was briefed the following morning. The mission was an armed reconnaissance sweep along a suspected supply route that crossed the Cambodian border approximately 15 clicks northwest of Copperhead. The route, designated Trail 79er on the intelligence maps, had been used by North Vietnamese Army logistics units to move supplies south into Tay Ninh province. Division wanted a visual confirmation of recent activity and, if targets of opportunity presented themselves, engagement. 2 Cobras would fly the mission, Pritchard and Caldwell in the lead ship, Thibodeau and his front seater, Specialist Curtis Weems, in the wing. The briefing was held in the operations hooch, a plywood and sandbag structure that smelled of stale coffee and mildew. Major Dale Murchison, the troop commander, conducted it. Murchison was on his second tour, a lean, graying man with a scar on his left forearm from a .50 caliber round that had come through the floor of a Huey in '69. He tapped the acetate overlay on the map with a grease pencil and traced the route. The crossing point was marked with a red circle. Beyond that circle, they would be in Cambodia, which was technically a neutral country, which meant, in the language of the war, that they were never there. Caldwell asked a question that surprised everyone. He asked whether the route could be extended 3 clicks further west, past a bend in a tributary that he said he had identified on aerial photographs as a possible staging area. Murchison looked at him for a moment, then at the map, and said he would consider it. After the briefing, Thibodeau caught Pritchard's arm outside the hooch. He said, "Who asked to go deeper?" "Caldwell asked to go deeper." Pritchard pulled his arm free and walked to the flight line without answering. That evening, Pritchard sat on the sandbag wall outside his hooch and wrote a letter to Louise. The light was failing, and he used a red lens flashlight to see the page. He did not write about the mission. He wrote about the garden they were going to plant when he got home. Tomatoes, squash, pole beans. He wrote about the house they had talked about buying in Huntsville, the one with the screened porch. He folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in the mail pouch. Then he took out the Polaroid camera he had bought at the PX in Bien Hoa and loaded a fresh cartridge of film. He had been taking photographs of the firebase, the aircraft, the bunkers, the sunsets, to bring home as a record. He placed the camera in his flight suit pocket, on the right side, opposite his .38. He did not know that in 48 hours, a different Polaroid, one he did not take, would be placed in the left breast pocket of that same flight suit, and that it would remain there for 31 years, sealed in plastic, waiting in the dark. The after-action report, filed 9 days after Operation Stone Lantern and classified confidential, stated that AH-1G, tail number 67 X-ray X-ray 284, was struck by automatic weapons fire at an altitude of approximately 200 feet while conducting armed reconnaissance west of the Cambodian border. The report stated that the aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent and impacted in a rice paddy. The report stated that both crew members, Captain Wendell A. Pritchard and First Lieutenant Marvin D. Caldwell, were killed on impact. The report was signed by a Captain Glenn Hargrove, not the same Hargrove who would lead the 2003 recovery, though the coincidence of the name would later cause confusion. And it was countersigned by Major Dale Murchison, troop commander, who had not been present at the crash site. The report was wrong. Not in its description of the shootdown, which was broadly accurate. The Cobra had taken fire, multiple hits from what was probably a 12.7 mm heavy machine gun concealed in a tree line along the tributary that Caldwell had asked to investigate. Thibodeau, flying wing 200 meters behind and offset to the right, saw the tracers come up in a bright, lazy arc, the way they always did when you were far enough away to watch them. And then the lead Cobra's tail boom snapped left and the aircraft began to rotate. Pritchard's voice came over the radio, calm and flat, the way pilots' voices always were when things were going very badly. He said, "Talon 16 is hit. We are going in." Then static. The Cobra hit the paddy at a shallow angle, plowing a furrow through the mud and water before coming to rest on its left side. The rotor blades struck the ground and disintegrated, throwing fragments in a wide arc. Thibodeau made 2 low passes over the crash site, taking fire both times, and reported that he could see no movement in the cockpit. He marked the position on his map, called for a search and rescue package, and returned to Copperhead to rearm and refuel. By the time a recovery team reached the area the following day, the site was cold. No enemy contact, no survivors, no bodies visible. The Cobra was already sinking into the waterlogged paddy. The recovery team, under fire from a different direction, was extracted after 40 minutes on the ground. Both crew members were carried as missing in action. This was the official version of events, and for 31 years, it was the only version. It was the version that Louise Pritchard received in a telegram. It was the version that Marvin Caldwell's wife, a woman named Delia, received in San Antonio. It was the version that went into the files at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis. And it was wrong. Dr. Elena Vasquez's forensic examination of Pritchard's remains, conducted at the JPAC Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii in the autumn of 2003, revealed the following. Captain Pritchard had survived the crash. His injuries, a fractured left femur, 3 broken ribs, a dislocated right shoulder, were severe but not fatal. There was no evidence of a fatal head injury. There was no evidence of a broken neck. The cause of death, determined by a series of radiographic and chemical analyses that took 4 months to complete, was a combination of shock, internal hemorrhaging from a lacerated spleen, and exposure. In plain language, Pritchard had bled to death slowly, probably over a period of 12 to 24 hours, while strapped into his seat harness. But here was the detail that turned a recovery into an investigation. Pritchard had not been strapped into his harness at the time of the crash. The harness buckle showed tool marks consistent with being opened and reclosed. The lap belt had been threaded through its latch from the wrong direction, the direction it would go if someone standing outside the cockpit had reached in and buckled it, rather than the pilot buckling himself in from the seat. Pritchard had been placed back in his seat, after the crash, after he was already injured. And the front cockpit canopy had been opened from the outside, using the external jettison handle, which was designed for ground crew use and required a deliberate two-handed motion to activate. Someone had climbed out of the front seat, walked around to the side of the aircraft, opened the back cockpit to check on the pilot, and then, finding Pritchard alive but badly hurt, had made a decision. That someone had strapped the injured pilot back into his seat, closed the canopy, and walked away. Thibodeau reached by telephone at his home in Houma, Louisiana in January of 2004, was 81 years old, and his memory was precise. He remembered the shootdown as clearly as he remembered his own wedding. He said he had always believed both men died in the crash. He said the recovery team that went in the next day had reported no signs of life. He said he had carried the weight of it for 30 years. When the JPAC investigator told him that Caldwell had apparently survived and walked away, Thibodeau was silent for a long time. Then he said one word. He said, "West." When asked to explain, he said, "Caldwell always looked west, even on the firebase. Always looking west, toward Cambodia, like he was expecting someone, or measuring the distance. That boy was always measuring." The investigator thanked him and asked one more question. Had Thibodeau ever seen Caldwell with a camera? Thibodeau thought about it. He said, "Pritchard had a camera, a Polaroid. He was always taking pictures. Caldwell, not that I recall. But I tell you what, when we cleaned out their hooches after the shootdown, Pritchard's camera was gone. It wasn't in the hooch, and it wasn't on the aircraft inventory. It was just gone." 3 days after the crash, someone had taken a Polaroid photograph of 2 men in a Bangkok hotel room. One of those men was dying, or already dead, in a rice paddy 200 miles to the east. The other was smiling, standing next to a man whose identity has never been established, wearing civilian clothes and holding in his right hand what appeared to be a passport. And in a Bangkok pawn shop, 4 days after the crash, someone had pawned a United States Army First Lieutenant's class ring. The inscription inside the band read, "M.C., West Point, 1968. The pawn ticket was found in a sealed map case inside the Cobra's cockpit, tucked behind the instrument panel, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. A receipt for a life that was being exchanged for another. The file landed on Dale Murchison's desk on a Tuesday in the late autumn of 2003, and he did not open it immediately. He set it beside his coffee, which was cold, and looked at it. The file was a standard JPAC case folder, buff-colored with a red classification stripe across the top and a case number stamped in black ink. The case number meant nothing to him. The name on the tab did. He was not the same Dale Murchison who had commanded Talon Troop in 1972. That Murchison had died of pancreatic cancer in 1989 in a VA hospital in Fayetteville, North Carolina, without ever speaking publicly about Operation Stone Lantern or the 2 men he had lost on it. This Murchison, the one staring at the file, was a civilian analyst at JPAC, 61 years old, a former Army CID investigator who had spent the last 11 years of his career processing MIA cases from Vietnam, Korea, and the Second World War. He was methodical, patient, and very close to retirement. He had requested the assignment himself, not because he had any connection to the Talon Troop case, but because the forensic report had flagged anomalies that required criminal investigation experience to evaluate. He opened the file. The first page was Dr. Vasquez's summary. He read it twice. Then he turned to the original 1972 after-action report and read the witness statement on page 3, the sworn affidavit claiming both crew members had died on impact. The statement was signed by Captain Glenn Hargrove. Murchison pulled up Hargrove's service record. Captain Glenn Hargrove had been assigned to the division's personnel section at Long Bin, not to Talon Troop. On the date of the crash, Hargrove had signed the daily duty roster at Long Bin, 240 miles from the border. He could not have witnessed the crash. He could not have been at the crash site. Yet his statement described the wreckage in specific detail: the position of the aircraft, the condition of the cockpits, the fact that both canopies were intact. Details that someone had given him. Details that someone had needed on the official record. Murchison made a note in the margin of the file. He wrote, "Who briefed Hargrove?" He underlined it. The office was quiet. It was late afternoon in Hawaii, and the trade winds were pushing clouds across the Kuilau Range, casting moving shadows across the parking lot outside his window. Murchison's desk was orderly. A lamp, a telephone, a computer he used reluctantly, and a framed photograph of his daughter's wedding. He was not a man given to intuition. He trusted procedure, sequence, evidence. But something about this case made him uneasy in a way that was not entirely professional. The file had the feel of a thing that had been constructed, not reported. The witness statement was too detailed for a man who had not been there. The casualty report was too clean for a crash in hostile territory with no recovery of remains. The paperwork had the smooth, seamless quality of a story told by someone who had practiced it. He spent the rest of the afternoon reading the personnel files of every officer assigned to Talon Troop in the spring and summer of '72. Most were unremarkable. Routine tours, routine decorations, routine separations from service. Caldwell's file was different. It was thin. Too thin for a West Point graduate with 2 years of service. The efficiency reports were there, the assignment orders were there, but the personal section, next of kin, emergency contacts, financial records, had been partially redacted. Not the standard redaction of a declassified file, where sensitive information is blacked out with a marker. This was the surgical kind, pages removed entirely, leaving only the numbered tabs where they had been. Murchison called the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis and asked for the complete, unredacted file. The clerk told him it would take 6 to 8 weeks. He said he would wait. While he waited, he did what any good investigator does. He worked the edges. He requested the maintenance logs for tail number 67 X-ray X-ray 284, going back to the day it arrived in country. He requested the operations logs for Talon Troop for the month of the shootdown. He requested the communication logs for the radio relay station that handled Talon's tactical frequency. Most of these records had been archived, microfilmed, and shipped to the Washington National Record Center in Suitland, Maryland. Some had been damaged in a warehouse flood in 1981. Some were simply missing. But the maintenance logs survived, and in them, Murchison found a small entry that did not belong. 3 days before Operation Stone Lantern, someone had signed out a survival kit from the Cobra's emergency stores, the kit that was bolted under the front gunner's seat, containing a first aid pouch, water purification tablets, a compass, a signal mirror, a knife, and 2 days' worth of rations. The sign-out sheet bore the initials M.D.C. The kit had never been signed back in. Murchison stared at the entry. A front-seater removing his own survival kit before a mission. Not transferring it to another aircraft. Removing it. Taking it somewhere. 3 days before the flight that was supposed to kill him. He closed the file and sat in the dimming light for a long time. Outside, the shadows of the clouds moved across the mountains like slow, dark hands. He opened his desk drawer and took out a photograph that had been included with the forensic report. A high-resolution scan of the Polaroid found in Pritchard's pocket. He studied the two faces. Pritchard, stiff, unsmiling, looking at the camera with an expression that might have been pain or might have been something else. And Caldwell, relaxed, smiling, wearing a short-sleeved shirt with no collar, looking like a man on vacation. Behind them, a window with curtains, a bed with a floral spread, a mirror on the wall reflecting part of the room that the camera did not directly capture. Murchison took a magnifying glass from his drawer and held it over the mirror in the photograph. In the reflection, barely visible, he could see a third figure, partially obscured, standing near a doorway, holding something dark and folded that might have been clothing, or might have been a uniform. He put the magnifying glass down. He picked up the phone and called the FBI field office in Honolulu. That evening, he drove home along the H-1 freeway past Pearl Harbor, where the masts of the Arizona still break the surface of the water, and he thought about a man who had removed his survival kit 3 days before a mission, who had asked his pilot to fly deeper into enemy territory, and who had walked away from a crash that should have killed him, leaving his pilot strapped into a seat to die. The Polaroid was the proof. But the pawn ticket, the survival kit, the false witness statement, these were the architecture. This was not a man who had seized an opportunity. This was a man who had built one. And somewhere in the files that were still making their way from St. Louis, Murchison believed, was the reason why. Delia Caldwell lived in a small white house on the east side of San Antonio, in a neighborhood of chain-link fences and pecan trees, where the sidewalks buckled from the roots. She was 71 years old, and she had not used her married name in conversation for more than 20 years. She went by her maiden name, Delia Fontaine, and she worked part-time at a dry cleaner on Nogalito Street, pressing shirts. She had never remarried. Murchison found her through the VA records. The address had not changed since 1972. He flew to San Antonio in the early spring of 2004, rented a car at the airport, and drove through a city that smelled of cedar smoke and mesquite. He did not call ahead. In his experience, people who received phone calls from government investigators had time to prepare, and preparation, in his line of work, was another word for concealment. She answered the door on the second knock. She was a small woman, thin, with gray hair pulled back in a clip, and she looked at his credentials without expression. She did not seem surprised. She said, "I wondered when you would come." She said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed, not recently, but long ago, and then stopped rehearsing because they assumed it would never be needed. She let him in. The house was clean and spare. A sofa with a crocheted throw, a television with a rabbit ear antenna, a kitchen table with a formica top and 2 chairs. No photographs on the walls. Murchison noted this. In his experience, widows of MIA soldiers either kept photographs everywhere, like shrines, or kept none at all. The absence usually meant something. She made coffee. It was weak, served in cups with faded roses on them, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded. The afternoon light came through the window in a slant, catching the dust in the air. A clock ticked on the wall above the stove. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. Murchison told her what they had found. He told her about the Cobra in the rice paddy, about Pritchard's remains, about the empty front seat. He did not mention the Polaroid. He wanted to see what she would say first. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He is dead, isn't he?" It was not a question. It was a statement delivered with the particular flatness of a person who has known something for a long time and has finally been given permission to say it out loud. Murchison asked what she meant. She said, "Marvin is dead. He has been dead for a while. I can tell by the way you are talking. You are not here to tell me he is alive. You are here to find out if I knew." Murchison said he did not know whether Caldwell was alive or dead. He said the investigation was ongoing. He asked her when she had last heard from her husband. She was quiet for a long time. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Then she told him about the letter. In the autumn of 1977, 5 years after the crash, she had received an envelope in her mailbox. No return address. Postmarked Hong Kong. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a cashier's check for $12,000 drawn on a Hong Kong bank. The paper contained one handwritten sentence. She did not recognize the handwriting. It was not Marvin's, she was certain of that. She said she read the sentence once, then burned the letter and the envelope in the kitchen sink. She cashed the check. Murchison asked her what the sentence said. She shook her head. She said, "I burned it. He asked her again. She said, "I cannot tell you what it said, because if I tell you, you will know what he did, and then you will find him. And finding him will not bring back the other man, the one who stayed in the helicopter." Murchison did not press. He had learned, over decades, that silence was more productive than pressure, and that the things people refused to say were often more revealing than the things they said. He changed the subject. He asked about the money. Had there been more? Had she received other payments, other letters? She said no, just the one. $12,000. She had used it to pay off the house. She gestured around the kitchen, at the formica table, the faded curtains, the clean, bare walls. "This house," she said. He asked her one more question. He asked if anyone else had ever come to ask about Marvin. She hesitated. Then she said, "A man came once, in 1982. He did not show credentials. He said he was from the government, but he was not like you. He was younger, and he was wearing a suit that was too expensive for a government man. He asked the same questions you are asking. I told him nothing. He left." Murchison thanked her and stood up. He placed his card on the table and told her to call if she thought of anything else. She did not pick up the card. She walked him to the door and stood on the porch while he went down the steps. He was halfway to his rental car when she spoke. She said, "Mr. Murchison." He turned. She was standing in the doorway, holding the screen door open with one hand, and her face, in the late afternoon light, had an expression that he would later describe in his notes as not grief, not anger, but a kind of exhausted resolve, as if she had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just decided not to put it down. She said, "The sentence in the letter, it said, 'He did not suffer.' That is all it said." Murchison drove back to his hotel. He sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the air conditioning on and thought about a woman who had received a letter telling her that the man her husband had left to die in a rice paddy had not suffered, and who had taken the money and paid off her house, and who had lived with that knowledge for 27 years in a small white house with no photographs on the walls. He looked in his rearview mirror before pulling out. A dark sedan was parked across the street from the hotel entrance, engine running, windows tinted. As Murchison pulled into traffic, the sedan pulled out behind him. It followed him for 3 blocks, then turned left and disappeared. He made a note of the license plate. When he ran it through the system 2 days later, back in Hawaii, the registration came back to a rental company in San Antonio. The rental record for that vehicle, for that date, had been deleted. The flight to Phnom Penh took 19 hours, with a layover in Tokyo that lasted long enough for Murchison to drink 2 cups of vending machine coffee and read the Caldwell personnel file that had finally arrived from St. Louis. It was still incomplete. 3 pages remained redacted, but what was there confirmed his suspicion. In March of 1972, 3 months before the shootdown, a military intelligence officer at division headquarters had flagged Caldwell for investigation. The reason? Unauthorized contact with a civilian contractor operating in the border region, a man identified in the file only by a code designation, Gemstone. The nature of the contact was not specified, but the recommending officer's summary used a phrase that Murchison circled twice with his pen. Possible involvement in diversion of military materiel. Diversion of military materiel. In the language of 1972, that meant black market. Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts. The pipeline of war materiel that leaked at every joint, from the docks at Cam Ranh Bay to the fire bases on the border, and that enriched a network of middlemen, contractors, and corrupt officers whose activities were an open secret and a closed investigation. Caldwell, it appeared, had found his way into that network, or the network had found him. And the officer who had filed the intelligence flag the one who had reported Caldwell's unauthorized contacts, was Captain Wendell Pritchard. Murchison read the entry 3 times. Pritchard had turned in his own front seater. He had filed a report through the intelligence chain identifying Caldwell as a security risk. The report had gone to Division, where it had been noted, filed, and apparently not acted upon. No investigation was opened. No action was taken. Caldwell was not removed from flight status, was not transferred, was not interviewed. The report simply disappeared into the bureaucracy of a war that was producing more paperwork than it could process. But Caldwell would have known. In a unit as small as Talon Troop, secrets had a half-life measured in hours. The interpreters talked. The radio operators talked. Someone in the intelligence section at Division would have mentioned it to someone at the personnel section, who would have mentioned it to someone who flew down to Copperhead on a resupply bird. Caldwell would have known that Pritchard had reported him, and he would have known what that report could mean, not just the end of his career, but a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, and a federal prison sentence. The flight to Ratanakiri Province from Phnom Penh was a twin-engine turboprop that shook so badly Murchison could not read his notes. He arrived at the provincial capital in the early afternoon, in heat that hit him like a wall when he stepped off the aircraft. The air smelled of wood smoke and fish sauce, and the particular wet earth smell of the Cambodian lowlands in the dry season. A JPAC liaison officer named Captain Torres met him at the airstrip with a land cruiser and a translator, a young Cambodian man named Samnang, who spoke English with an Australian accent and wore mirrored sunglasses. Sok Vanara's farm was 40 minutes from the airstrip, down a red dirt road that became a red dirt track that became 2 ruts in the grass. The Paddy, where the Cobra had been found, was still partially excavated, the drainage ditches cut by the recovery team still visible, the mud stained dark in the rectangle where the aircraft had lain. Sok Vanara was waiting for them in the shade of a jackfruit tree, sitting on a plastic chair, a thin man in his 70s with the kind of weathered patience that comes from a lifetime of work that depends on rain. Through Samnang, Murchison asked him about the day the helicopter crashed. Sok Vanara nodded. He remembered it very well. He had been a young man then, not yet 30, and the war had not yet reached this far east. He had been in the Paddy, a different Paddy, closer to the tree line, when he heard the sound. Not the helicopter, which he had heard many times. The American helicopters flew over often, high up, going west. This sound was different. A tearing, crunching sound, and then silence. And then the whine of an engine running with no load, which stopped after a few minutes. He waited. He was afraid. When he finally went to look, he found the helicopter on its side in the Paddy, half submerged, the rotor blades broken, and 2 men. Murchison leaned forward. Samnang translated. 2 men, Sok Vanara said, both alive. One was in the back seat, the upper seat, and he was hurt. His leg was at a wrong angle and there was blood on his face. He was conscious, but he could not move. The other man, the one from the front seat, the lower seat, was standing beside the helicopter. He was not badly hurt. He had a cut on his forehead, and he was holding his left arm against his body, but he was standing, and he was calm. Sok Vanara paused. He looked at the excavated Paddy, then back at Murchison. The man who was standing, he said, making a small motion with his hand, he helped the hurt one. He climbed up on the side of the helicopter, and he reached into the back seat, and he did something with the straps. He adjusted the hurt man's body. He put him in a straighter position. Then he closed the cover. Samnang supplied the word canopy and climbed down. And he stood there for a moment, looking at the hurt man through the glass, and then he picked up a bag, a green bag, like a soldier's bag, and he walked away, to the west, into the trees. Murchison asked, "The hurt man was alive when the other man walked away?" Sok Vanara said, "Yes, His eyes were open. He was looking at the man who was leaving. The air was very still. The heat pressed down on them. A cicada screamed in the jackfruit tree and stopped. Murchison asked, "Did the man who walked away ever come back?" Sok Vanara looked at him. Then he looked at Samnang, and he spoke for a long time, and Samnang's expression changed. When he translated, his voice was quieter. "Yes," Sok Vanara said. "He came back 3 days later." Sok Vanara was in the same paddy, working, and the man came out of the tree line from the west, walking on the dike between the fields. He was wearing different clothes, not the green uniform, but regular clothes, a shirt and trousers. He walked directly to the helicopter. He climbed up on the fuselage and opened the back canopy again. He reached inside. He stayed there for a few minutes. Then he climbed down, and he stood beside the helicopter, and he was holding a small camera. Sok Vanara made the shape of a rectangle with his hands, and he looked at it, and he put something inside the cockpit, in the pocket of the dead man's clothing. Murchison said, "The pilot was dead by then?" Sok Vanara said, "Yes. By the second day the smell had started. By the third day there were flies. The man who came back, he covered his face when he opened the cover. He put something in the dead man's clothing, and then he closed the cover again, and he climbed down, and he walked away again to the west. He was carrying a second photograph." Sok Vanara made the rectangle shape again, in his hand. He walked into the trees, and he did not come back. Murchison sat in the shade of the jackfruit tree for a long time after Sok Vanara finished speaking. Torres offered him water. He took it. The heat was enormous, flattening, and the excavated paddy shimmered in the light like a wound in the earth. The Polaroid had not been a souvenir. It had not been an accident. Caldwell had come back, 3 days later, in civilian clothes, having crossed into Thailand and back, specifically to place that photograph in the pocket of the man he had left to die. He had opened the cockpit, endured the smell of decomposition, and tucked the Polaroid into Pritchard's flight suit. And then he had walked away again, carrying a second photograph that no one had ever seen. Why? Why come back? Why leave evidence of your own survival on the body of the man whose death you had arranged? Murchison had a theory, but he did not share it with Torres or Samnang. He kept it in his head, where it sat like a stone, and on the flight back to Phnom Penh, he took out the scan of the Polaroid and looked at it again, at Caldwell's smile, at Pritchard's stiff, pained expression. And for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before. Pritchard, in the photograph, was not standing. He was sitting in a chair. And his left hand, barely visible at the bottom of the frame, was gripping the armrest with the white-knuckled intensity of a man in considerable pain. The photograph had been taken before the crash. Pritchard was already hurt, or drugged, when the picture was made. The date on the border was a lie, and the entire timeline that Murchison had been constructing in his head began to shift and crack, like ice on a river in spring. The trail was cold, but it was not invisible. Cold trails leave marks, not footprints, but the negative space where footprints should have been and were not. Gaps in records, names that appear once and never again, addresses that exist on paper but not on the ground. Murchison had followed this kind of trail before, in fraud cases and desertion cases and the occasional espionage referral, and he knew that the key was not to look for the person, but to look for the person's needs. Everyone needs money. Everyone needs documents. Everyone needs a place to sleep. Follow the needs, and you find the ghost. The pawn ticket was the first thread. It had been recovered from the Cobra's cockpit in a sealed map case, a rigid, waterproof tube that pilots use to carry navigation charts, tucked behind the instrument panel. The ticket was from a shop called Sombat & Sons on Cherwin Kroon Road in Bangkok, dated 4 days after the shootdown. The pawned item was described as a gold ring, military insignia, inscribed. The value given was 1,800 Thai baht, which in 1972 was approximately $90. The ticket had never been redeemed. Murchison sent a request through diplomatic channels to the Thai National Police, asking whether Sambat and Sons still existed. It did not. It had closed in 1985 when the building was demolished to make way for a hotel. But the police records office in Bangkok had the shop's ledger books in storage, and a clerk, working through a weekend on overtime that Murchison paid for out of his own pocket, found the entry. The ring had been brought in by a man who presented a Canadian passport in the name of Martin Calloway. The passport number was recorded. Martin Calloway, M.C. The initials were not subtle. Murchison noted this with the particular displeasure of an investigator who finds his subject both more organized and less careful than expected. A man who plans his own disappearance with the precision of a military operation, who removes his survival kit 3 days early, who arranges a false witness statement, who returns to plant evidence on a corpse, and then uses his own initials on his alias. It was either arrogance or a signal, and Murchison was not yet sure which. The Canadian passport number led to the next thread. Through a liaison with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Murchison obtained the passport application filed in Bangkok in the summer of 1972. The photograph on the application showed a man consistent with Caldwell's service photograph, though thinner, with longer hair and a mustache. The application listed a birthplace of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and a local address in Bangkok, a residential hotel on Sukhumvit Road called the Ban Sukawati. The reference on the application was a name Murchison did not recognize, Raymond Lowe, listed as a business associate with an address in Singapore. The Ban Sukawati was still standing. It was no longer a hotel. It had been converted into apartments in the 1990s. But the current owner, a Thai-Chinese businessman, had purchased the building's records along with the property, and after a series of phone calls and a modest payment facilitated by Captain Torres, he produced a registration card for Martin Calloway, dated the summer of 1972, with a checkout date in the autumn of the same year. 3 months. Caldwell, Calloway, had lived in Bangkok for 3 months after the crash before moving on. The trail went from Bangkok to Hong Kong, where the name Martin Calloway appeared on a business registration in 1973, a trading company called Pacific Rim Consolidated, dealing in surplus military equipment. This was the post-war gold rush. The American withdrawal from Vietnam left behind mountains of equipment: trucks, generators, radios, aircraft parts, medical supplies, and a thriving gray market emerged to buy, refurbish, and resell it to governments across Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. It was legal in the loosest sense, quasi-legal in practice, and enormously profitable. Caldwell had positioned himself at the center of it. Murchison spent 2 weeks in Hong Kong, working through corporate records at the company's registry. Pacific Rim Consolidated had been active from 73 to 81, generating revenues that Murchison estimated, from the tax filings, at several $1,000,000. The company's sole director was Martin Calloway. Its registered agent was Raymond Lowe, the same name from the passport application. Lowe turned out to be a Singapore-based businessman with connections to the defense surplus trade across the region, a man who appeared in the files of at least 3 intelligence agencies without ever being charged with anything. The company dissolved in '81. Calloway's name disappeared from the Hong Kong records, but it resurfaced in Singapore in 1983 on the registration of a private limited company called Dorado Maritime, which dealt in shipping and logistics. Murchison traced this company through the 80s and 90s. It moved cargo between Singapore, Jakarta, and Manila, and its client list, obtained through a Singapore police liaison, included several entities that had previously been identified as fronts for arms trafficking. He was building a picture, and the picture was of a man who had stepped out of one life and into another with the practiced ease of someone changing clothes. Caldwell had not simply deserted. He had prepared an exit, executed it, and then built a career in the gray space between legal commerce and criminal enterprise, using the skills and contacts he had developed during his time on the Cambodian border. The unauthorized contacts that Pritchard had reported, the conversations with a civilian contractor known as Gemstone, had not been the beginning of Caldwell's involvement in the black market. They had been the recruitment phase. By the time the Cobra went down, Caldwell already had a passport, a bank account, and a business partner waiting for him in Bangkok. But one detail nagged at Murchison, and he could not resolve it. The letter to Delia Caldwell, postmarked Hong Kong, 1977, containing one sentence and $12,000. He did not suffer. If Caldwell had wanted to disappear completely, why send money to the wife he had abandoned? Why send a message about Pritchard's death? Guilt was the obvious answer, but Murchison had dealt with enough criminals to know that guilt rarely expressed itself in such precise, transactional terms. The money was not a gift, it was a payment, a settlement, as if Caldwell were closing an account. And the sentence, "He did not suffer," was not an expression of remorse. It was a lie. Pritchard had suffered. He had bled to death slowly, strapped into a seat in a swamp, watching the man who was supposed to be his partner walk away into the trees. If Caldwell had written that sentence, he was not apologizing. He was constructing a version of events that allowed Delia to live with the money. He was buying her silence with a comfortable fiction. There was someone else in this story, the third figure in the mirror, the one Murchison had seen in the Polaroid, standing in the doorway of the Bangkok hotel room, holding something dark and folded. That person had never been identified. And someone had visited Delia in San Antonio in 1982, a man in an expensive suit who was not from the government. And someone had followed Murchison from Delia's house to his hotel in a rented sedan whose records had been erased. The trail did not end with Caldwell. It led through him to someone else, and Murchison did not yet know who. The 3 missing pages from Caldwell's personnel file arrived from St. Louis in a plain brown envelope sent by registered mail 6 months after Murchison's original request. They had been located in a misfiled box in a warehouse annex, according to the cover letter, which Murchison read with the skepticism of a man who has been told similar stories before. Misfiled, for 30 years, in a system that processed millions of records and lost very few of them. The pages were photocopies of photocopies, grainy and faded, but legible. The first was a memorandum from the military intelligence officer at division headquarters, dated March of 1972, summarizing the flag on Caldwell's file. Murchison had seen a reference to this document in the redacted version. Now he had the full text. It was brief and clinical. First Lieutenant Caldwell had been observed meeting with a civilian contractor, codenamed Gemstone, on 3 occasions outside the perimeter of LZ Copperhead. The meetings had been reported by, and here Murchison stopped reading. The meetings had been reported by Captain Wendell Pritchard, the reporting officer, in a sworn statement dated February of 1972. Murchison had known this. He had found the reference in the earlier records. What he had not known, what the unredacted page now revealed, was the content of Pritchard's statement. Pritchard had not simply reported that Caldwell was meeting with a contractor. He had reported that Caldwell had offered to include him. Pritchard's statement, transcribed in full on the second page, described a conversation that had taken place in the hooch at LZ Copperhead late at night in February. Caldwell had come to Pritchard and told him, in plain language, that he had been approached by people who were running a supply pipeline across the border, military supplies going out, money and contraband coming back, and that he had agreed to participate. He told Pritchard that the operation was protected at division level, that several officers in the logistics chain were involved, and that the risk was minimal. He told Pritchard that his cut, if he agreed to look the other way during certain flights and to file certain reports without verifying them, would be $5,000 a month deposited in a bank account in Hong Kong. Pritchard had refused, and then, according to his own statement, he had done what a straight arrow does. He had reported it. He had gone to the intelligence section at division, and he had filed a sworn statement detailing everything Caldwell had told him. He had put his name on it. He had signed it. The third page was the response from division headquarters. It was a single paragraph, signed by a colonel whose name had been redacted even in this version. The paragraph stated that the matter had been reviewed and that no further action was warranted at this time. The flag would remain on Caldwell's file as a precautionary measure. Pritchard was thanked for his vigilance and reminded that the contents of his statement were classified. No further action was warranted. Murchison read the sentence again. A West Point officer had been identified as a participant in a black market pipeline that was diverting military supplies in a combat zone, and the response from division headquarters was a single paragraph that said, in effect, "Thank you, we will do nothing," which meant one of two things. Either the division intelligence section was incompetent, or the pipeline was protected, exactly as Caldwell had told Pritchard it was. Murchison sat at his desk and felt the shape of the case shift beneath him, the way the ground shifts in a slow earthquake, not violently, but with a deep structural wrongness that changes everything above it. Caldwell had not been a lone deserter. He had been a node in a network. The network had protected him before the crash, burying Pritchard's report, ensuring no investigation, and it had protected him after the crash, providing the false witness statement, the Canadian passport, the contacts in Bangkok. Captain Glenn Hargrove, the officer who had signed the witness statement from 240 miles away, had not been an innocent dupe recruited to file paperwork. He had been part of the network, and Pritchard had been the threat, the man who had refused the money and filed the report, the man who, as long as he was alive, could identify Caldwell, could identify the pipeline, could testify. The shoot-down had not been arranged. Murchison did not believe that even Caldwell could have arranged to be shot down by enemy fire, but the shoot-down had been anticipated. Caldwell had asked to extend the mission route into a known hot zone. He had removed his survival kit 3 days in advance. He had a passport and a contact waiting in Bangkok. He had been preparing for the moment when circumstances would give him an exit, and when the 12.7 opened up on them from the tree line, he had taken it. And then he had made a choice. Standing beside the crashed Cobra, looking at his pilot, the man who had reported him, the man who could destroy him, alive but badly injured, unable to move, Caldwell had made a choice that would define both of their lives. He had strapped Pritchard into his seat. He had closed the canopy, and he had walked away, knowing that Pritchard would die, slowly, in the heat and the water, and that by the time anyone found him, if anyone ever found him, there would be nothing left to tell the story. Except the Polaroid. Caldwell had come back 3 days later to place the Polaroid in Pritchard's pocket. Murchison now understood why. The photograph was not a confession. It was not guilt. It was insurance. The Polaroid, with its date and its image of Caldwell alive, was a dead man's switch. If the network ever turned on Caldwell, if the people who had protected him ever decided he was a liability, the photograph would ensure that his disappearance could not be erased. Someone, someday, would find Pritchard's remains, and the Polaroid would prove that Caldwell had survived the crash, and the investigation that followed would uncover the network. The Polaroid was aimed not at Pritchard, but at the people behind Caldwell, the colonel whose name was redacted, the contractors, the pipeline. It was Caldwell's way of saying, "If I go down, I am taking all of you with me. He had used a dead man as a safe deposit box. Murchison closed the file and looked at the photograph of his daughter's wedding on his desk. He thought about Pritchard, a man who had done the right thing, who had filed the report, who had refused the money, and who had died for it, slowly, in a rice paddy, watching the man who killed him walk away into the trees. And he thought about the Polaroid, sealed in its plastic bag, patient and terrible, waiting 31 years in the dark of a dead man's pocket for someone to find it. He picked up the phone and called the FBI. He said, "I need everything you have on a man named Raymond Lowe, based in Singapore. And I need the personnel file of a colonel at 1st Cavalry Division Headquarters, spring of '72, whose name has been redacted from a classified intelligence memorandum. I believe this individual authorized the suppression of a criminal investigation and facilitated the desertion of a commissioned officer." The FBI agent on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Murchison, are you aware that a referral on this case was made to us 8 months ago, and that the file was closed 2 weeks later at the request of another agency?" Murchison said, "Which agency?" The agent said, "I am not authorized to say." Murchison hung up the phone and sat in the dark of his office for a long time. The trade winds had stopped, and the air was heavy and still, and he could hear the flag on the pole outside the building hanging limp in the quiet. The report took Murchison 3 weeks to write. He worked on it in the evenings, after the regular workday, in his office at the JPAC laboratory, with the door closed and the blinds drawn. He was not, by nature, a secretive man, but the phone call with the FBI had changed the texture of the case. A referral that had been closed at the request of another agency meant that someone, somewhere in the apparatus of the federal government, did not want this investigation to continue. Murchison did not know who, and he did not know why, but he knew what it meant for his report. It would be read carefully by people who were looking for reasons to shelve it, and it needed to be precise enough to survive that scrutiny. He wrote it in the dry, factual language of a criminal investigation summary, stripping out speculation and presenting only what could be supported by physical evidence, documentary records, and witness statements. He organized it chronologically: the shoot-down, the forensic findings, the Polaroid, the pawn ticket, the personnel file, the witness statement from Sok Vanara, the interview with Delia Caldwell, the corporate trail through Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He included the maintenance log entry showing that Caldwell had removed his survival kit before the mission. He included the intelligence flag and Pritchard's sworn statement. He included the division headquarters response, "No further action warranted," and the redacted colonel's name. He did not include his theory about the Polaroid as a dead man's switch. That was interpretation, not evidence, and he knew the difference. On the last evening, he sat at his desk with the magnifying glass and the high-resolution scan of the Polaroid, and he looked at it one more time. He had studied this photograph so many times that the faces had become as familiar to him as his own family. Pritchard, sitting, gripping the armrest, his face tight. Caldwell, standing, smiling, his hand resting on the back of Pritchard's chair. The hotel room, the window, the curtains, the bed with the floral spread, and the mirror. The third figure in the mirror. Murchison had noted it in his report as an unidentified individual, partially visible in a wall mirror, appearing to hold a dark, folded object. He had sent the photograph to the FBI laboratory for enhancement, and the enhanced image had come back 2 weeks later. The figure was clearer now. A man of medium build, wearing a light-colored shirt, standing near a doorway at the far end of the room. The dark object in his hands was not clothing, as Murchison had initially thought. It was a folder, a document folder, the kind with a clasp. The man's face was still not clearly visible. The angle of the mirror and the distance from the camera reduced it to a blur of skin tone and shadow, but his posture was distinctive. He was standing very straight, with his weight evenly distributed, his shoulders square. It was the posture of a man who had been trained to stand at attention and had never entirely stopped. Murchison made a final note. He wrote, "The third individual in the Polaroid exhibits military bearing. His identity remains unknown. The document folder he is holding may be significant. Recommend further enhancement and comparison with known personnel photographs from 1st Cavalry Division Headquarters, Spring 1972. He sealed the report, signed the cover sheet, and placed it in the interoffice mail for the JPAC commander. Then he sat in his chair and listened to the silence. The laboratory was empty. The overhead lights in the corridor were on their nighttime setting, dim and blue. Through the window, he could see the lights of Pearl Harbor and, beyond them, the dark mass of Ford Island. The USS Missouri was berthed there, its superstructure lit up for the tourists, and Murchison looked at it and thought about the distance between wars. The distance between 1945 and 1972 and 2004, and how the same human failures repeated themselves across that distance, wearing different uniforms but making the same choices. He opened his desk drawer and took out the plastic evidence bag containing the original Polaroid. It had been returned to JPAC after the FBI analysis, logged back into the evidence chain, and placed in his custody as the lead investigator. He held it up to the desk lamp and looked at the faces one more time. Then he turned it over and looked at the word written on the back. The word that Hargrove, the recovery team leader, had not understood when he first pulled the photograph from the flooded Paddy. The word was gemstone. Caldwell had written the name of the network's civilian contact on the back of the Polaroid, not as a signature, not as a message to whoever found it, as a target. The Polaroid, with its date and its faces and its single word, was a weapon pointed at the people who had helped Caldwell disappear. A weapon that would activate only when the body was found and the photograph was opened, and someone like Murchison began to follow the thread. Murchison placed the Polaroid back in the evidence bag, sealed it, and put it in the lockbox under his desk. He turned off the lamp. He sat in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the building settle around him, the click of cooling ducts, the hum of the refrigeration units in the laboratory, the distant sound of traffic on the H1 freeway. Then he locked his office, walked to his car, and drove home through the warm Hawaiian night, past the turnoff for Pearl Harbor, past the memorial, past the sunken battleships whose crews were still down there, in the dark, after 60 years, waiting for someone to remember them. And he thought about Pritchard, whose wait was over now, whose bones were in the laboratory behind him, cleaned and catalogued and ready to go home. He thought about Caldwell, whose trail led from a rice paddy to Bangkok, to Hong Kong, to Singapore, and then nowhere. And he thought about the second Polaroid, the one the farmer said Caldwell had been holding when he walked away from the wreck for the last time. That photograph had never been found, and Murchison suspected that it contained the one piece of evidence that would make the entire case prosecutable: the face of the third man in the mirror, photographed clearly, without a mirror's distortion, looking directly at the camera. A photograph that Caldwell had kept for himself, as his own personal insurance, separate from the dead man's switch he had planted in Pritchard's pocket. Wherever Caldwell had gone, he had carried that second photograph with him. And wherever it was now, it was the key to a door that someone in the federal government had decided should remain closed. Captain Wendell Pritchard was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on a Wednesday in the late autumn of 2004, 32 years after his death. The ceremony was small. A detail of soldiers from the Old Guard carried the casket, which was draped with the flag, and a bugler played taps from a hill above Section 60, where the graves of the recent wars were beginning to fill the grass. The The sky was overcast, the color of old pewter, and the wind carried the smell of fallen leaves and distant rain. Louise Pritchard was there. She was 70 years old now, a small woman with white hair and steady hands, and she stood at the graveside without crying. She had done her crying 32 years ago, when the telegram came, and again when the empty casket was buried at the family plot in Boaz, Alabama, and again, quietly, in her kitchen, when the JPAC liaison officer had called to tell her that her husband's remains had been identified. She had no tears left for this, only a kind of still, clear-eyed attention, as if she wanted to memorize every detail. The sound of the rifle volleys, the fold of the flag, the weight of it when the sergeant placed it in her hands. Murchison stood at the back of the small group of mourners, wearing a dark suit and holding his hat in his hands. He had not been invited. He was not family, not a friend, not a comrade. He was the man who had read the file, and he had come because he felt that someone who knew the full story should be present when Pritchard was finally laid to rest. He did not approach Louise. He did not introduce himself. He stood under an oak tree whose leaves had turned the color of rust and watched the ceremony from a distance of 30 yards. And when it was over, he walked back to his rental car and sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. His report had been submitted. It had been received, reviewed, and, as he had expected, partially redacted before being forwarded to the FBI and the Army Criminal Investigation Division. The sections pertaining to the intelligence flag, the redacted colonel, and the division headquarters response had been removed. The sections pertaining to Caldwell's desertion, the forensic evidence, and the corporate trail remained. A formal referral had been made to the FBI for investigation of Caldwell's activities under the alias Martin Calloway. The referral was, in Murchison's professional judgment, an exercise in paperwork. Caldwell was dead. That fact had emerged, quietly, from the Singapore police records 3 months after Murchison's visit. Martin Calloway had died in a private hospital in Singapore in the summer of 1998, of complications from liver cancer. He was 52 years old. He had been living in a rented apartment in the Katong district, alone, under the Calloway name. His estate, such as it was, a bank account with a modest balance, a few pieces of furniture, a box of personal effects, had been handled by a local solicitor and, in the absence of any identifiable next of kin, transferred to the Singapore Public Trustee. The personal effects had been inventoried and stored. Murchison had requested the inventory. The box contained the following items: a Canadian passport, expired; a wristwatch, brand not specified, not working; a set of keys to an address that no longer existed; 3 paperback novels; a leather wallet containing 600 Singapore dollars, a driver's license in the name of Martin Calloway, and a business card for Raymond Lowe, with a handwritten phone number on the back that had been disconnected, and a sealed envelope, unmarked, containing a single Polaroid photograph. The Singapore police had not opened the envelope. When Murchison requested it through diplomatic channels, the public trustee's office located the box in a storage facility in Jurong and shipped it to the JPAC laboratory in Hawaii. Murchison opened the envelope himself, wearing cotton gloves, in the presence of 2 witnesses, and he removed the Polaroid and placed it on the light table and looked at it. It was a photograph of the same Bangkok hotel room. The same window, the same curtains, the same bed with the floral spread. But it was taken from a different angle, from the doorway, looking inward. And it showed 3 men. 2 of them were Pritchard and Caldwell, in the same positions as the other Polaroid, Pritchard sitting, Caldwell standing. The 3rd man was standing beside the bed, facing the camera. He was in his 40s, with a broad face and a receding hairline, and he was wearing the dress uniform of a United States Army colonel, with the insignia of the 1st Cavalry Division on his shoulder. His face was clearly visible. His expression was neutral. He was holding the document folder in his left hand, and his right hand was resting on Caldwell's shoulder. Murchison placed the photograph in an evidence bag and sealed it. He made a notation in his log. He did not write the colonel's name because he did not yet know it. But the face was clear, and the insignia was clear, and the records of every colonel assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division in the spring of 1972 were on file at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. The match would be made. The face would be identified. The question was, what would happen after that? Murchison submitted a supplemental report with the second Polaroid attached. 3 weeks later, he received a phone call from a man who identified himself only as a representative of the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. The man asked Murchison to confirm the chain of custody for the photograph. Murchison confirmed it. The man thanked him and said the matter was being reviewed at a level above Murchison's clearance. The call lasted 4 minutes. Murchison never heard from the man again. The supplemental report was not returned. It was not acknowledged. It entered the system and did not come out. Murchison made inquiries. The inquiries were not answered. He filed a formal request for the status of his report through his chain of command. The request was acknowledged and classified. 6 months later, Dale Murchison retired from JPAC. He moved to a small house on the north shore of Oahu, where the waves were loud enough to drown out thought. And he tended a garden and read books and did not discuss the Caldwell case with anyone. He had done what he could. He had found the body, read the evidence, followed the trail, and written the report. The rest was not his to control. But he kept one thing. Not the original. That was government property sealed in the evidence chain. A photocopy. A single photocopy of the first Polaroid, the one that had been in Pritchard's pocket, made on the office copier late one night before he submitted the original to evidence. He kept it in a cigar box in his desk drawer, under a pile of old letters and receipts. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the light was right and the wind was coming off the ocean, he would take it out and look at the two faces, the dead man and the man who had left him to die. And he would think about the second Polaroid, the one with the colonel's face, the one that was now somewhere in the federal system, behind a classification wall, in a quiet room where uncomfortable truths went to be forgotten. He thought about Pritchard, who had done the right thing and died for it. He thought about Caldwell, who had done the wrong thing and lived with it for 26 years, in rented apartments and under a borrowed name, until the cancer took him in a Singapore hospital alone. He thought about Louise Pritchard, standing at the graveside at Arlington with the folded flag in her hands. And he thought about Delia Caldwell, in her small white house in San Antonio, pressing shirts, living in a house that was paid for with silence. The Polaroid was the whole story, the proof that one man had survived, the proof that another man had been left to die, the proof that someone in uniform had stood in a hotel room in Bangkok in the middle of a war and made an arrangement that valued supply routes and profit margins above the life of a 27-year-old pilot from Boaz, Alabama, who had done nothing wrong except tell the truth. Murchison put the photocopy back in the cigar box, closed the lid, and slid the drawer shut. The sun was going down over the north shore, and the sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and green, the same colors that Pritchard had described in his last letter to Louise when he wrote about the sunsets at LZ Copperhead. Murchison did not know about that letter. He did not know that the colors matched. He went to the kitchen, heated water for tea, and stood at the window, watching the light fail over the Pacific. Somewhere in a storage facility in Washington, behind a locked door with a cipher code, the second Polaroid sat in a filing cabinet, in a folder, in a box. The colonel's face looked out from the photograph at no one. The file was closed. The door was locked. And 32 years after Captain Wendell Pritchard died in a rice paddy with his eyes open, watching the man in front of him walk away, the only thing that remained in the light, the only piece of the story that had not been redacted, classified, or quietly disappeared, was a photocopy of a faded Polaroid in a cigar box in a desk drawer in a house on the north shore of Oahu, where the waves were loud and the wind smelled of salt, and the dead were patient, and the living carried what they could. Thank you for staying till the end. It truly matters. Every subscription, every like, every share gives us the strength to keep searching. Hit the bell to be the first to hear about new investigations. These stories were never meant to stay silent.